Hello. The Shapes of History panel is part of the Tasveer Festival Watch, Read, Talk from October 1st to the 24th, 2021. Founded in the aftermath of 9/11, Tasveer is a Seattle-based arts organization whose social justice-driven mission is to amplify underrepresented South Asian voices in film, literature, and storytelling. The Tasveer Festival is a hybrid event showing the best in South Asian films. So at the moment, we are going through, we have the 16th Tasveer South Asian Film Festival, the best in literature. So the history panel is part of TSAL, the Tasveer South Asian Literary Festival, and Talk, which is storytelling. So this panel explores the ways in which history is intimately braided with the present and substantiates the adage, the past is never dead, and it's not even past. The contours of diverse South Asian polities and subjectivities emerge unavoidably and indelibly demarcated history. Here, history surfaces as not some smooth and linear passage of time, but a messy mix of conflicts, upheavals, resistance, wars, drawing of borders, and the transformations of collective and individual identities. We're very fortunate to have Professor Anand Yang moderate this panel, a Walker Family Endowed Professor of History and International Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. Professor Yang is the former chair of the History Department and the former director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. Professor Yang is the author of several books, including The Limited Raj, Bazaar India, 13 Months in China, and his latest 2020 book, Empire of Convicts, Indian Penal Labor in Colonial South Asia. As former editor of the Journal of Asian Studies and Peasant Studies, Professor Yang served as the president of the Association for Asian Studies in 2006 to 7, and the president of the World History Association 2008 to 10. Over to you, Professor Yang.
Thank you, Alka. I like the tagline that Tasveer uses. The past is never dead, it's not even past. A much quoted and misquoted phrase uttered by a character in one of American writers Faulkner's stories, which refers to the fact that the past is a part of us. We live with this. We live with it, its moral catastrophes, as well as its bright moments. In the US case, it's the legacy of racial history that haunts it. That past is all around us and cannot really be relegated to the past. In the South Asia case, the legacy is more complex and made up of many more elements. And although when you sort of dive into these books, perhaps we shouldn't lose sight of the Faulkner story, that in that story, this phrase is uttered, both in a sense of despair, but it also kind of hints at a glimmer of hope, a belief that people will rise above racial divisions and recognize the ties that bind us all. In all the excellent books we'll be featuring today, Karachi Vice, Night March, Love's Garden, Midnight's Border, and my own study entitled Empire of Convicts, people, places, and processes are very much entangled in complicated histories. And although bookstores, libraries, and publishers may set these books apart by genre, many are the similarities between and among them, even as they vary from fiction to nonfiction or creative nonfiction, as some of the works are self-described. As Alka has already said, I'm Anand Yang. I'm a Delhi boy who moved to the US to attend college. I'm a historian who also works in a policy school, the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, because you have in front of you bios that Tasveer has provided all of you about our panelists. I won't go into them other than to underline that our panelists today are exemplary public intellectuals, writers and scholars who are models of social and public engagement. Samira Shackle is a contributor to the news media in Britain, often reports on Pakistan, where some members of her family still reside. Her book, Karachi Vice, Life and Death in a Divided City, draws on her experiences of living and visiting that amazingly sprawling city of 20 million. She will be followed by Alpa Shah, who grew up in Nairobi and is now based in London, where she's a professor at the London School of Economics. She too writes for various news outlets in Britain and also in India. Her previous book on shadows of the state, indigenous politics, environmentalism, and insurgency in Jharkhand isn't exactly a prequel to Night March, but it's not unrelated. I found it very helpful that I already knew that book before I launched into Night March. Nandini Bhattacharya also wears many hats, a professor of English who's written a number of academic books, including one on Bollywood. She also writes stories and poems, and she will be sharing with us, and this must be a very exciting moment for her, her debut novel, Love's Garden. Our fourth and final panelist is Suchitra Vijayan, who is a barrister by training and profession. Previously, she worked for the UN War Crimes Tribunal in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and is now founder and executive director of the Police Project, a New York-based hybrid research and journalism organization. Her body is on Midnight's Borders, a people's history of modern India. Shall we start out beginning with Samira to introduce our books? And if you wish to, excerpt your book for the readers and our listeners.
Sure, thank you so much for the introduction, Anand, and it's great to be here with so many brilliant writers on South Asia. It's a real privilege. Yeah, so my book is Karachi Vice, as you said, and it draws on about 10 years or so of my own sort of journalistic and personal experience in the city. As you said, it's where my mother comes from. It's my mother's hometown, and I still have a lot of relatives there, although I grew up in London. And the book, it really focuses in on a period of about 10 years or so from around 2008 up until the present. And that was one of the most recent sort of convulsions of violence in Karachi. It's the site of all sorts of different urban conflicts. And that's ever since Pakistan was founded in 1947, it's sort of had these different convulsions of violence. And I focused in on the most recent, so it's a kind of recent history. But it's interesting in thinking about the sort of name of this panel, Shapes of History. There's sort of echoes of a longer past in the recent, more recent violence. So to sort of put it quite broadly, the context, Karachi was the capital of Pakistan at the beginning when the nation was founded in 1947 at the partition of India. It's no longer the capital, that's now Islamabad, but it was at that point. And it was also, it was and remains the economic heart of Pakistan. So it's a place where people go to sort of make their fortune, to get jobs. It's a place of economic promise and so on. So whenever there are waves of migration, the first being post-partition and subsequently because of conflict in other parts of the country or in Afghanistan or natural disasters around Pakistan, people gravitate towards Karachi. And it's a city where the population has swelled much more quickly than the infrastructure or facilities or resources have kept pace with. And so that means that there is a lot of vying for resources, for space, for political power between different ethnic groups. You have the sort of main ethnic groups of Pakistan all represented there and clashing often in quite violent ethno-political movements, which is often very tied to street crime. So that's the kind of the background of the book. But the way I've told it, it really focuses in on personal stories because what struck me when I started spending substantial time in Pakistan as an adult when I was, and it was about 2011, I think. And what really struck me when I moved there was, I moved to work as a journalist, was just the way that there was this extraordinary level of violence, sort of ambient violence in a way, just going on in the background. It's a huge city, as you said, it's sprawling, it's huge. It's almost like many, many cities sort of next to each other, as these mega cities often are. And it was the way that, normal life just sort of goes on in and around this extraordinary level of, you had running street battles in one part of town, you had multiple suicide attacks in a week sometimes at that point, and yet still, not only were people sort of getting on with the usual business of life as people do, but people in all sorts of ways were trying to make life better for their communities, for their, not just their own families, but people around them. And so the book focuses on 5 people who I felt represented something about the city in different ways. They all actually, this wasn't quite deliberate, but it was a happy accident that they all ended up being, each one was one of the different major ethnic groups of Pakistan. So there's an ambulance driver called Safdar, who is, he's originally from the north of the country, he's Pashtun, and he works for the Edhi Foundation, which is a big philanthropic, it's a charity basically, which fills many gaps left by the state, including the ambulance service. So there's no state ambulance service, it's run by this charity. So I told his story. Parveen, who's a young woman who's from Liari, which is an area of the city that's often known for gang warfare. There's the sort of run by gangsters for big spells of the 90s and 2000s. And she lived there working as a teacher and later as a social activist. There's Siraj, who lives in Arangi town, which is another site of ethnic conflict there between the Mahajirs who moved from India at the time of partition, and the Pashtuns from the north of the country. Siraj is Mahajir. And he's a map maker and cartographer who sort of works on getting undocumented areas regularized so that they can access services, which sounds like it would be a kind of fairly mundane job, but it's extraordinarily dangerous because it brings him into conflict with land mafias and all sorts of criminal interests that control real estate and so on. And then there's Jannat, who's a young woman at the edge of the city, who's one of the Sindhi villages. Sindhis are the indigenous people of that province. And her village was at threat from a huge new development, a sort of new private city being built at the edge of Karachi, and they're just razing many villages to the ground. And the last was Zille, who's a crime reporter who kind of got hooked on the danger, really. He was the first person of the 5 who I'd met. I profiled him for The Guardian back in 2015. And he sort of covers all these different things in the city, from the rise of terrorist violence to the police crackdown, which I detail in the book. So from around 2014, there's a very sort of violent police crackdown on the city. And I got the idea when I profiled Zille and Safdar separately, and I'm a crime reporter and an ambulance driver from totally different worlds, and then realized they had experienced so many events in the city. They'd both experienced them, even though they didn't know each other, didn't have anything in common. So that was basically the starting point. So it's very much through a close focus on those people, and in the background is these kind of big forces. And if I don't know if I've got time left, but I could read a page or two. Is there time, or should we move on? Yeah. So I thought I'd just read you a very short section from where Parveen is introduced. So she's an amazing woman. Parveen is the young woman from Liari, which is the area often known for gang violence. So I'll just read you a short section introducing the area and her. They called it a slum, but Liari was Parveen's home in all its overcrowded glory. The area was as old as Karachi, not like the newer settlements that had sprung up on the periphery of the city as the population expanded. The history was there in the architecture, the tall and majestic old apartment blocks of a bygone era, painted in pastel colors with ornate but depleted plasterwork, like aging aristocrats who had fallen on hard times. They stood cheek by jowl with squat concrete buildings, crammed in to accommodate a swelling populace, structures so close together that there seemed to be no gap between them at all. Some were topped with rusting corrugated iron sheets, held down crudely with bricks on each corner, others with half-finished plaster, the metal webbing still visible as if the buildings had been caught in a state of undress. Throughout her teenage years, Parveen had seen street schools. One in particular stuck in her mind, a place she had spotted as she walked between two relatives' homes in the late 1990s. It seemed like a small oasis of order in an otherwise chaotic place. Students of all ages were squatting on a rug laid out on the street, squinting at the chalkboard through the afternoon sunlight and the clouds of dust kicked up by auto rickshaws and motorbikes speeding past. The demarcations of the school were daubed onto the wall of the building behind it in paint, a crudely strung up curtain on each side, giving the impression, if not the actuality, of privacy. People crossed over the road to walk on the other side so as not to interrupt the lessons. In one form or another, street schools had been running in Liari since the 1960s, free open-air teaching set up by the community to counteract endemic government neglect. Some kids were sent there to augment the teaching they got at underfunded government schools, or because their parents wanted to keep them occupied and away from drug dealers. Others, older teenagers, a few adults, had jobs as day laborers or in factories. Liari was a poor area. Many people dropped out of school to work, only to find later that their career prospects were limited by illiteracy. Parveen, who had always wanted to do something for her people, knew she had to find out more. In 2001, when Parveen was 19 and had only just finished her own education, she got a teaching job. Although they called it a street school, the establishment on Liari's Shahbeg Lane where she worked sat on top of a building a few stories high, hemmed in by low perimeter walls and wooden boards painted bright green. From up here, you could see the familiar higgledy-piggledy buildings of Liari stretching out on all sides. The school taught Urdu reading and writing, basic English and maths. Parveen loved teaching and finding out about her students' lives, but she also loved organizing, and within a year she was involved in the day-to-day management of the school. Sometimes she and another teacher would take an auto rickshaw out of the area, through the warren of congested alleys and under the cartoonist yellow arches that shouted, "Welcome to Liari town," in English and Urdu. From here, the city opened out onto a wide freeway, a vast expanse of tarmac and cars, and they'd ride all the way to Urdu Bazaar, a hectic cluster of stalls and shops selling books and stationery on Muhammad Ali Jinnah Road. Here they would seek out the secondhand stalls that stocked battered textbooks, sometimes with pages missing or scrawls in the margins, whatever they could find to supplement their teaching. Yeah, that's just a short section, so introducing Parveen and the area, and as I said, the way I sort of did it was just spending huge amounts of time with people, and it really goes into their personal stories with the city as an almost kind of another character in the background. So hopefully that gave a flavor.
Thank you. The question has already popped up, but I think this is a question that will be repeated to every one of you, because central to all your texts are a number of key characters that you focus on, and you narrate your stories through these individuals you've selected. And that of course makes for a very compelling account of whatever you're focusing on. So I don't know whether we should pose this question to Samira right now or wait till everyone's done. Wait till everyone's done, because I think that's central to everyone's text. It's about people, and it's about figuring out how to find the right people that embody certain kinds of things you want your stories to relay, but also to relate your characters to what Samira called big forces or larger structures in which these individuals are embedded. And it's this tension and dynamic between individuals and the larger forces and processes that they're caught up in that makes for such a powerful and compelling, and at times a very dark tale of what you're relating. So let's hold off that and turn to Alpa, if you'll do what Samira just did. Thank you very much, Samira.
Thank you. Thanks, Samira. Thank you so much, Anand. It's such a pleasure to be here in your company and also with Nandini and Suchitra, and I thank the Sphere and all the organizers for bringing us together. I've been very excited about today, mainly because I want to learn also from my co-panelists and hear their stories and the backstories of their books and their journeys. And yeah, so in terms of mine, I mean, so I'm not a journalist, but I'm an academic and I'm an anthropologist, and I happen to have done a lot of the research that went into Night March by chance to some extent. You know, we anthropologists are trained to kind of follow our noses and to, you know, discard all our research proposals once we go into the field and figure out, you know, what are the most interesting questions, and are trained not to follow a story, but to follow everything, you know, to think about kinship and religion and economics and, you know, and live in communities, but try to understand the wider forces of history, if you like, you know, that are transforming them and shaping them. And so my own path is very much, you know, paved by or created by this kind of background. And I happen to have ended up in the state called Jharkhand in Eastern India. In fact, before it became a state, back in 1999, it used to be part of Bihar, southern Bihar, and you know, it was purely by chance that I ended up there, and I got intrigued by all kinds of questions. At first, I was really interested in development and you know, like big development schemes like being thought about in ivory tower offices like the World Bank and the United Nations, and how they were like trickling down to people on the ground. And of course, I found that in this part of India, on which, you know, the Lonely Planet, size of kind of Ireland, but on which the Lonely Planet had about, you know, a little paragraph which basically said don't go there, and which was, you know, had the reputation of being one of the most violent and poor parts of the country. You know, I found that these schemes actually didn't actually even exist. They existed on paper, but they didn't exist in practice. And so I got interested in various kinds of efforts that were trying to, you know, challenge the inequalities that people in this area were facing, which I saw as being part of, you know, the global structures of inequality. And so my first book, as Anand said, was, you know, a book called In the Shadows of the State, looking at development schemes and indigenous rights activism and how it impacted or not, you know, on indigenous people. So this area also houses people that are called tribal populations, you know, who are called Adivasis since the 1930s. This term, which is actually brought about by Christian missionaries, has become much more popular as a way of calling a kind of lots of different kinds of people who have who live in the hills and forests of central and eastern India, and are quite different to much of the society of the caste plains. They, to some extent, they've lived from forest livelihoods and shifting cultivating and a bit of agriculture and some wage labor, and have managed to have some kind of autonomy over their livelihoods, which is quite different to more poor societies in the agricultural plains, Dalits in the agricultural plains. And part of this is because they have historically fought wars against the appropriation of their land and appropriation of their forests for British colonial policy, British colonial development, and so some protections have been kept in place, which have enabled Adivasis to have access to their lands, protections which have been degraded over time and which actually become a central part of my story in Night March. So anyways, I was in this area. I've been working in this area for many years, since 1999, and, you know, visiting. I've spent 4.5 years living amongst tribal people in these parts of India, but visiting over the past, you know, 20 years or so, and going, you know, and have, you know, going every year almost until recently. And then I started to realize that, the class dynamics of all these development efforts are really important and are being neglected by the various kinds of agencies and human rights activism going on in the area. And then I found this movement, which is supposed to like take class struggle really seriously, that had been around for 50 years in India, that saw itself as making history. And this movement was the Naxalite movement, a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist inspired struggle that had been in India basically spread with urban intellectuals, graduates of some of the kind of most prestigious universities in India, had started off in the late 1960s and 1970s, but people had gone underground, and there'd been various rounds of state repression, and the whole idea they had was that they wanted to form they wanted to bring about a revolution in India, which a war against the state, which a war against the ruling classes, a war against the state, which they believed could only be achieved through the barrel of the gun, and that it had to be a protracted people's war, a Maoist-style protracted people's war that would begin in the countryside and eventually take over the cities in a bid to take over the state, and eventually, with a dream of forming a much more utopian, much more idealistic, much better society, a communist one, much more equal one. And so, these guys had basically retreated from the agricultural plains of India, which had been their strongholds in the 1980s and in the 1990s, retreated into the forests and hills of central and eastern India amongst the indigenous people, these were kind of better guerrilla terrain for them because there was a lot of state repression at the time. And so I was there as an anthropologist, living amongst the indigenous people, amongst the Adivasis, and some of my friends started getting interested in the Naxalites and joining them and or being recruited for them. And initially I just saw them as a kind of protection racketeers, as gangs who were trying to use their muscle power, like all politicians did in these areas, and like all MLAs did in these areas, to gain access to resources, development schemes which they took taxes off, and I saw them very much as kind of protection racketeers, like the Sicilian mafia, with these big muscle men who've got their own kind of who are taking taxes off everybody else and lining their own pockets, and also being big men. But then over time, I started to realize that actually more and more Adivasis were joining them, and it wasn't just like the elites of the areas who were joining, who were supporting them, and that actually, these guys really took class struggle very seriously. And I thought, well, I need to really understand them, understand what's going on. Why are so many Adivasis joining them? And so I, by this time I was already a lecturer at Goldsmiths, and anyway, I managed to get some grants to go back to India and spend another 1.5 years in the Adivasi areas. And I spent some time in one of the strongholds with one round where the movement had been present for the last 30 years or so. And I did what all anthropologists do, just moved into one of the mud huts with a local woman who I call Sombari in the book, and I did everything that she did: go and fetch firewood from the forest and go to the market on every Friday, and and then through that base try to understand the much wider area, get to understand all the kinship relations of Adivasis, and I thought, when I started the research, I'd never meet a Maoist or a guerrilla, or and I that this would be a book about that. This research would be about Adivasis and how this area has changed over time. But I realized that the guerrillas were everywhere. On the first night I got I got there was a knock on the door by the zonal commander of the area in the middle of the night saying, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And, this interrogation that went into the night for a few 4 hours or so. And I explained what I was doing. And it so happened that many of the Naxalites in this area, they were actually, they were intellectuals in and of their own rights. And they were graduates, and they were very, they kind of, they gave me the benefit of the doubt and probably watched me from afar, over the next 3 months. And then slowly over time, they started to call me to spend more and more time with them because they were living in the forests and in mobile kind of guerrilla armies who were completely moving the whole time. And this also happened to be a time when the Indian government decided that, this was the greatest internal security threat that the country had ever faced, and sent in 100,000 security forces to surround these guerrilla zones. And so this research, which I had been planning for, many years, happened to come into fruition at the same time as these security forces were sent to surround these areas. And so unintentionally, I thought I would be kind of kicked out of the area anytime, but so unintentionally my research had to kind of go undercover, I basically, I spent more and more time with the guerrillas and tried to understand not only the Adivasi villages, but also the guerrilla armies, and interviewed all the leaders and spent more and more time moving with them through the country. So as I was saying, the Indian government said that this is, that this was the greatest internal security threat, and the country had faced. And the reason why this was happening was basically these areas are also house some of the greatest mineral reserves in India. So there's coal, there's iron ore, there's bauxite, and more. And after liberalization in 1991, multinational corporations of every hue have wanted to, are eyeing the land, or want to get in. And as I said earlier, these lands have been protected for Adivasis because of the colonial battles that the Adivasis fought to a certain extent. And so, human rights activists were saying that the reason why these counterinsurgency efforts were underway was in order to clear the land, because Adivasis needed to moved out of the land. In neighboring Chhattisgarh, there was this horrific movement called the Salva Judam, which basically set alight many indigenous people's villages, which lots of very horrible kind of massacres of indigenous people, a kind of clearing of the land. And you would see these processes also taking shape in some forms in Jharkhand too. And anyway, so then I had done all this research over 1.5 years, and also based on my previous experiences there, and I realized that the stories that I had were just kind of astonishing, and they were so different to the kind of accounts that were out there in the popular in the news and as written by journalists or human rights activists too, because there was the Naxalite issue was becoming extremely polarized. There were, on the one hand, people who were calling these people terrorists, and on the other hand, there were people who were saying that here we are, indigenous people have no option but to take up arms against what's going on in these areas. And so there was this kind of romanticization of this movement, and indigenous people joining them, and also on the other hand, the creation of them as terrorists. And this is, of course, a very common thing that happens with such insurgencies. We've seen it in Vietnam, we've seen it in Peru. You get these kind of accounts which are of either, saying that people are joining them also because they are greedy or they have, grievances. And what I was realizing is that actually something much more complicated is going on here. And actually, the reason why many Adivasis were joining them was very much to do with kinship relations and the way in which the Naxalite leaders had managed to kind of embed themselves in these villages. And kinship relations flowed in and out of these villages. They flowed, for young men who were joining the movement as guerrilla soldiers, like my bodyguard Coley, who I talk about in Night March. It was like going to another home. He had a fight with his father back in the village, and he went off, and spent 6 months with the Naxalites, and then came back, and then he'd spend another 6 months. And so this was like a lot of fluidity, and so all of these really insightful issues started to emerge, or the contradictions of such movements. On the one hand, how they were also creating their gangs within the movement, creating their own destruction. On the one hand, how they were the Naxalites were claiming to be wanting an egalitarian world, wanting women's liberation, but at the same time were ignoring the forms of egalitarianism that already existed amongst the Adivasis. So, how men like the leaders, they were almost like religious renouncers, even though this was a deeply secular movement. So I realized, I felt the burden of these stories, especially when I came back from England and from India and started writing up. And I thought, I can't write another academic account. It's just too important. People need to know, the complexities of what's happening on the ground. And so I decided to, basically try to convey the scholarship that went into this work for a general audience. And I told the story of what's happening in Central and Eastern India through the story of 5 people, a bit like of Samira, 5 characters who represent kind of quintessential kind of types through my research. And I told the story, so I'm telling the story of these 5 characters who are very different, and how they come together in this movement, and how they fall apart, and how that is a kind of metaphor for the movement itself. And also I happened to have done, right at the end of my field research, this incredible journey whereby I went to interview a central committee leader in Gaya in Bihar. I didn't know what I was going to do and where I was going and who I was going to meet, but then I ended up, walking with a guerrilla platoon 250 kilometers over the course of 7 nights. From Bihar back to Jharkhand, to the place where I had done my field research, and this was at the peak of these counterinsurgency operations. And so I framed the book which is called Night March as a story of this march, which also is a way to introduce these characters, and which also the march itself tells you the story of this movement and what's happening in contemporary India. So it's a book which is not like structured like an academic text. It has to be kind of read from the beginning to the end, and there's this beauty of this movement, which suddenly which over time undermines itself, and so, and I learned from writers of fiction, it's very nice to be in the company here. I don't know, and I've probably gone on for too long. I could read something if you. I can't hear you, Anand, sorry.
How about if we come back to you for?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah, that's totally fine. Yeah.
So as Alpa has already said, it's quite a coincidence, and I think there's no magic to the number 5, but there are 5 main characters, as she's already pointed out in her book too. It's also a nice segue to Nandini's debut novel, because her account begins in Bihar before it moves us to Kolkata. So Nandini, take us into a very different kind of realm and a different kind of writing in some ways. Love's Garden.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
So yeah, this is with all the page marks. This is the book, and it is a debut novel, and it's what a journey it has been. So I want to start by saying, as I've listened to Anand and Samira and Alpa, and no doubt when Suchitra speaks, it will be to her too, how struck I am by the commonalities, even though I think I'm the only fiction writer here. But as you might know, I have an academic background, and I'm going to mention a few sort of routes from that to fiction in a second. But what I've been thinking about is how wonderfully all these are stories really of resistance. And I have to say that I am awed by you creative nonfiction or journalist people and activists and really political workers. I'm awed by your courage and your chutzpah. I mean, the things you've done, I don't think I would have the courage to do it in a million years. So what I've been doing is hiding behind, the computer screen and just trying to imagine people who have tried to be resistant to other or related oppressions, past and present. I'm going to just minimize the screen so I can read something that I've written because I'm terrible at improvising. So in terms of what my book is about, what Love's Garden is about, I'm going to kind of start a little bit in a general way and say that following on from the kinds of questions we had in mind for the Shapes of History panel, I thought about what I have done and why I've done it. And I have to say, I think I'm motivated to write fiction out of something like a quest for the impossible. One of my very favorite writers, maybe my most favorite writer of all time, Jose Saramago, said that all his writing is about something impossible. In other words, if he didn't have something impossible to envision, he probably couldn't write. And I happen to have come to writing fiction myself from being a serious academic. And some would say I've landed hard on writing fiction. And I've done that coming from academia. I've written 3 scholarly books, and while Anand said the most recent one was about Hindi cinema, the 2 previous ones were colonial and post-colonial discourse analysis and sort of literary criticism and theory. But a time came when somehow what I learned during that research seemed important to write about as stories, as imaginative literature rather than academic prose. In part for reaching out to maybe a wider audience, but also in part because I felt like a certain medium, a certain register, a certain style was becoming imperative for me to convey the importance of the stories that I was reading about in my research. So I had to become a creative writer. So, and in making up my mind to do that, in a sense, you may say that I have made my own decision to reach into the impossible, because if you are an academic, you probably know that it's a bit of a no-no to go from academic writing to creative writing. Anyhow, no apologies, just to continue. So my book is historical fiction, but as a fiction writer, when I think about historical fiction, I still think of it as a search for something that's considered impossible. I think it could be a search for justice, truth, beauty, love, meaning, the categorical imperative, or whatever. But unless the object of the writing and the envisioning is slightly beyond the realms of the so-called possible, I think I cannot write a story or form characters around it. So I think for me, what it means to tell my stories is to keep alive in them a strong vein of what is generally considered the impossible or the outright fabulous. And where that connects to women's stories and resistance, I'll be coming to in a second. But in my view, the truth comes out of fables. So I write about fellow human beings that I haven't lived with for 6 months or interviewed or spent months and years observing and talking to, but that have been in my head for months or years, and that I've been living with in that sense. Because at this point, I think we're all entitled to compassionate perspectives from others and of others. So I feel that I've written in part, if there is an ethical angle to my writing, my novel, is to demonstrate the possibility of compassion, even where it might seem impossible. And that's kind of how I try to inhabit all my characters, at least. And of course, there are many constraints, mainly the desire to give up because the job seems almost impossible is a very big one. But if I may be facetious, I'd have loved to ask Sisyphus how the rolling up the stone felt every day at the beginning and at the end, and maybe over a martini. But anyway, so what's Love's Garden about? I would say Love's Garden mainly asks why some women embrace motherhood and others resist or refuse it. That is a sort of foundational complex, I would say, from which the story evolved in my head. In that sense, it is a sort of story of resistance, as so many of the other stories we've been listening to are. And I know we will hear about it again from Suchitra. But I think, again, it is Saramago who says that the point of resistance is not to win, but to outlast the opposition. And Alpa's story of the night march and the night marchers in particular is so resonant with so much literature and film that is so close to my Bengali heart. Mahashweta Devi, Sunil Gangopadhyay, Shamaresh Boshu, Sudhir Mishra, who's actually a Bollywood filmmaker, but of a different kind, Mrinal Sen, Ritik Ghatak, and of course in our own times, Arundhati Roy. So stories of women's resistance to patriarchy, I think, must count as among the earliest stories of resistance. And I loved and have loved those stories as among the authors I just mentioned. And women, I think, are historically the resistors of the species for many unfortunate reasons. And so the characters in my novel, Love's Garden, I'm almost feeling today as I'm listening, are a sort of prehistory of the 21st century sagas of popular resistance. This story begins in early 20th century India. There are two village girls, one rich, and this is still during the British Raj. It's approximately the cusp of the 19th and the 20th centuries. Two village girls, one rich, the other poor. They promise to love and stand by each other forever. Neither one can keep her promise. The rich girl marries a rich man and the poor girl marries a poor man. But marriage and motherhood ultimately separate and kind of destroy both of them. And broken promises twist into bitter feuding between their descendants. Anyway, as the decades pass also and India's history rolls on as resistance to the British Empire and anti-colonial and nationalist movements become powerful, and as the world fights fascism, as India fights the British, the fortunes of our two girls' descendants change dramatically. And in free India, it is the rich girl's family that supported the Raj that loses everything. And the poor girl's descendants who supported to some extent supported the freedom fighters are rewarded, but it's a bittersweet victory for both sides. But ultimately, as freedom also brings a new day for women in India to some extent, though this is of course a highly modified statement or modifiable statement in the light of gender violence during the partition and other things, communal violence in India and Pakistan. Light falls though on the truth that both were ultimately chattel for men who made and broke the rules as they pleased. And so it's when that story is finally able to be told that the new generations can choose forgiveness and unite to build something new. I mean, we are still living that future. That's pretty much what I have to say about my novel. And if you like, I can read a couple pages from that at this point. Shall I, Anand? You're muted, but I'll.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm going to read a little bit of a less serious part of it. And this, as I said, I'm both a Bollywood scholar and I've done some work on colonial history. And this is kind of a combination, maybe a little melding of the two areas that used to be my sort of academic hunting grounds. So this is chapter 21, and the date is 1990. This is my primary protagonist, Lady Prem Mitter in Calcutta after the war, unhappy in marriage and nursing a number of other losses and griefs from her past that I will let you find out about on your own if you want to. But here she is. She lives in Calcutta in a great mansion with her husband, not happy, and sort of to distract herself, Prem does find another occupation. Some would call it recreation, though, which feeds some of her restless longing for romance, charm, and beauty in life. She loves this new thing called the Bioscope. It's been around for over 20 years, of course, but in the village, she hadn't even heard of it, or just vaguely. And by the way, I'm going to skip, so won't be reading everything. Every time a new film is publicized, a servant queues up at the box office to buy tickets for Lady Mitter and the 4 or 5 upper maids or distant relations who will accompany her. Then comes the day, and led by Prem herself, the lesser ladies troop into the Rolls Royce and, with their sari veils carefully pulled low over their faces, troop out to the ladies' lounge of the great theaters, newly built for audiences that can't get enough of this new delight. Prem notes with care and detail how the actresses walk, talk, and sing, how they fan themselves in distress and faint easily and all the time, and must be revived by cordials. It fills her with admiration and aching longing. How fair they are, and how their hair is always so carefully layered, scalloped and crimped across their forehead and temples, a style she immediately adopts instead of that huge bouffant style she once thought the height of fashion. Sir Norrin, that is her husband, Sir Norrin Mitter, harangues. On his cheerier days, he snorts. Prem doesn't heed him. She's begun to learn how to wipe her husband out of scenes he makes unbearably distasteful. That would be most scenes of daily life. In revenge, she pastes him into Bioscope scenarios where he fares badly. In one, the film called Bilet Perot, which basically means returned from England, Prem silently but ecstatically identifies him as the hand-fed cur of the master race who believes his frantic tail wagging has transported him to a certain heaven called Anglo-Saxonness. There he coos and smokes his cheroot in Pakka English suit boot, peering down from his lofty perch through the obligatory pince-nez on fellow Indians, speaking to them when absolutely unavoidable in a high-pitched, precious drone. Prem begins to see the time she is living in. The country is swinging between the traditional and the modern. The mercilessly reamed, foreign returned Bengali fop, rejecting all things traditional, gives her the clearest view of who her husband is or would like to be considered. A modern Indian, a westernized Indian, with no patience or tolerance for old ways, old values, still a domestic tyrant, as many of his forefathers have been, but a votary of all things English in mien. She doesn't at all chide her women for falling off the ladies' lounge seats, laughing during Bilet Perot. All the world may be a stage, but a stage is also all that the world isn't. In the Bioscope, you can meet so many strangers. Will you come with me to the Bioscope? She asked her husband once. constantly living through other lives sometimes makes the harshest reality flicker. He raised his eyebrows so high they might disappear altogether, saying no more. Why not? Prem insisted. She didn't know why that day she was especially reckless. To see prostitutes perform their tricks in front of 100 people rather than one. Of course, all actresses are supposed to be prostitutes themselves as well as daughters of prostitutes, like Sushila Bala, who acted in Bilet Perut, simultaneously swooned over as a star and derided as a whore. Young men of rich families are known to squander their youth in the honeycombs of such queen bees, then grow into irate ranters and damn them as the very gates to hell. Prem leaves the room. All those beautiful, stylish, poised women in the films, nothing but prostitutes? Maybe, but who made them so? I don't know if I'm supposed to say anything. That was the passage I wanted to read.
Thank you. So Chitra, are you trying to show a video?
No, I just have a photograph, but I can show it. It's not important.
Yeah, I did not in introducing. So Chitra underlined the fact that she's also a photographer, along with her many other talents. So, go ahead. Did you want to, let's see.
I'll try and keep it really short. So the book. So before, I just want to really thank the Sphere for putting this remarkable panel together. And I think one of the great joys of this panel was actually reading all of your works and getting to know all of your works. I had read Alpa's work before because we were trying to do a conversation with her. But it was also really great to just learn and just the lyrical quality of the work that comes through. There's fiction, nonfiction. And also, as Nandini says, Saramago is also one of my favorite writers. And one of the things I think Saramago says in The Blindness, and he says that the difficult part is not living with people, it is trying to understand them. And I think for me as a writer or a photographer or as a lawyer or any of these hats that I've worn, it's always about trying to make sense of my social world. I'm actually very jealous of writers of fiction because I've always wanted to be a writer of fiction, but I've always been so scared to write fiction that nonfiction is where I hide. So when Nandini talks about this, it also is like quite interesting for me that I find fiction to be the hardest to write. Nonfiction is easier because it somehow feels that you're bearing witness to a moment and you're trying to humanize yourself by bearing witness, not humanizing the others. And I think that is also an important part of the conversations we're having, who gets to tell these stories. Midnight's Borders is, I feel like it started as a very young person trying to make sense of the world and just went out of hand. I thought this work would take me about 6 months and it took me over 8 years. So over 8 years, I traveled through India's vast land borders, bordering 7 countries. And what you have is a fraction of those encounters written as a book. It starts with the Afghanistan-Pakistan border and then goes to Bangladesh, and then from Bangladesh in the east to all the way to Pakistan, along the way through Myanmar and Kashmir and many other communities that have been destroyed by the partition, but also the act of drawing these lines. For me, the book was also about asking questions about what it means to think about freedom. What does it mean to think about people who write, who survive, who sometimes also resist in ways that we are trying to learn? One of the things that I wanted to do with this book is really not to bear witness or do the act of giving voice to the voiceless. And that's something I write about in the book. This book, because the people who appear in the book, not 5, but many others, I don't have a set numbers, there are many characters who appear in the book. My job was not to give them a voice. They were eloquent, articulate voices of their own predicament. In some ways, I felt that what they needed was not someone to tell their stories, but rather through their stories, I could critique. This was an ethnography of power. This was a critique of the nation state, but also fundamentally go back to the questions of if the nation state hasn't manage to even provide the most basic of dignities to the people, then what is the function of this nation state? How can we reimagine freedom? Because many of the people you encounter in this book had already started reimagining those ideas of freedom. The book initially started as a photography project, but then very quickly it became clear that this couldn't just be a photography project. So instead it became a book. And today I have the privilege of having this conversation with all of you. Because we have some of these questions that we're going to be talking about, I'm just going to read small excerpts and then we can quickly jump into the other conversations. And also I would love to hear from the other speakers today. I'm very quickly going to just share the screen. This is the only photograph I'm going to share. Can you see the photograph? Yeah. So I'm just going to, this photograph relates to the section that I'm going to read. So I'm just going to very quickly read. If you fear loneliness, you cannot be a soldier or honest man. Masood said these words as he quickly smoked a small hand-rolled cigarette packed with a mix of hashish and tobacco. He was almost 40 when I met him in the winter of 2012 in the remote border town of Paktika province in Afghanistan. By then, he had been many things: a smuggler, a fixer, a translator, a mercenary. These days, he called himself a businessman and worked with everyone: the Americans, the Afghans, the Iranians, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Haqqanis, and the Taliban. He was one of the many minor strongmen with muscles and money that the decade-long US military presence in Afghanistan had produced. He helped grease the wheels of military occupation. It was 6 o'clock in the evening, but already cold and dark. About 12 of us sat huddled in a room made warm by the fire and a couple of cheap Chinese heaters that had seen better days. I was the only woman among men who laughed, sang, and ate stuffed chicken with raisins, smoked hashish, complained about their wives, exchanged video clips, and retold stories from their childhood. The men in that room were meant to be on the opposite sides of the never-ending war on terror led by the US military and its Afghan allies against the Taliban. But on a frightfully cold night, among men with murky pasts and even murkier alliances, such absolutes don't exist. After dinner, Masood showed me an old photograph of his father, folded and creased from being carried in his wallet. The back of the picture read Feb 26, 1980. Masood's father, then a young man, stood in the middle of a group of Mujahideen guerrilla fighters in Afghanistan. He wore a small winter jacket over his Pathan suit, a military uniform hat, a waist belt made of bullet cartridges, and he held a gun in his left hand. In May of 1980, Masood fled to Pakistan province of Peshawar with his grandmother. In August, news arrived of his father's death. Causes unknown. Hafiz, Masood said, pointing to the other man in the room, can tell you everything. He remembers everything. All the important dates, the fighting. I just remember being hungry all the time. Masood went on. My great-grandfather and father fought for the British. My father fought the Russians. They were called heroes first and then terrorists. I picked up the gun at 14. With a gun, I wasn't hungry anymore. Now they pay people like me to fight him. He pointed to a young man with a black turban sitting across the room. No one knows who they are fighting anymore. But I no longer fight other people's wars. I'm not a soldier. I'm a businessman. So this is from the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. And just going to, sorry, I'm not sure how to bring this to an end. I'll stop the share. I'm just going to quickly share another segment, which is very similar, which kind of goes to the heart of the other question we talked about, the ethics of documentation. This is from the India-Bangla border, and this relates to one of the young girls who were killed by the border security force. So this kind of, so I go to see the family. I couldn't meet them, so instead I go to the site of where this girl was killed. This incident happened almost 10 years ago. So I'm just going to read from that section. The next day, I left for the village of Fulbury, a 7-hour drive from Malda, where Felani Khartoum was shot next to border pillar number 947. Fulbury lies right next to the border fence, less than 1,000 feet from Bangladesh. Through the Bangladeshi rights organization I was in touch with, I connected with a local teacher who met me a few miles outside the village. From there, we walked to the village and through a narrow lane that Felani and her father Narul passed through to cross from India to Bangladesh. It was evening and I stood a few yards from where Felani had been killed. The earth was wet and the smell of recent rain was still in the air. Ashraf Ali, a witness to the murder who lives 2 minutes away from the spot, joined us and pointed where he saw Felani hanging for hours after she died there. Felani was the eldest of 6 children. Her father, Narul Islam, and his family lived in Assam. When he first crossed the border with his mother, it was still porous. He was very young and his father had just died. They moved so they could earn a living. He worked as a rat picker, pulled rickshaws, and worked in the brick fields. All his children, including Felani, were born in India. Narul Islam had arranged Felani's marriage with a maternal cousin, Muhammad Amjad Ali, who worked at a garment manufacturing factory in Dhaka. To cross the border for the wedding, Narul made deal with an Indian smuggler for $40 or 3,000 rupees. Felani never made it to the other side of the fence. When Felani's clothes got caught in the barbed wire, she started to scream. In response, the Indian border guard, Ameya Ghosh, opened fire at her. The bullet hit Felani's chest and she fell onto the barbed wire fence. In an interview with Odhikar, a human rights organization, Narul Islam said that he began to scream out for his daughter. But when the BSF aimed their guns at him, he had moved away. After that, he lost his consciousness. 5 hours later, Felani was brought down. That day, standing just a few feet away from where Narul Islam lost his child, I saw 2 children running around and playing with an orange and purple kite. I picked up my camera to take a picture, but Ali requested that I not. The children here had known Felani. Here, lullabies and bedtime stories are cautionary tales of how not to stray too close to the border fence. Their images don't need to become a part of an archive of violence. Let them be children playing with kites, not bodies to be photographed next to the site of violence. I apologized immediately and watched the children chase the kites. Some moments do not have to become a photograph. As I watched the children play, I didn't quite know what I had expected to see. What memories of violence can a physical border fence hold? I saw one little girl, no older than 4, pluck some purple flowers growing near the fence. Flowers bloom here regardless of the ruined lives, anguish and traumatic experiences, and children chase orange and purple kites. Life prevails over death, if only freedom could as well.
Thank you very much. We've got plenty of time to have a discussion as well as respond to questions. And one set of questions that have come up that also fit in very nicely with mine is really about why we choose to write about the characters we do. In making those choices, whether it's the 5 people or whether it's Prem or whether it's some of the people Suchitra picks up at different points in her long journey, are there certain characters we have left out or we leave out deliberately because they don't tell the stories we're trying so hard to tell? So how do we make these choices? As a historian, I make the choices in part based on the archives. So when I write about certain convicts, they're the ones I can write about because there are no traces on anyone else. So I'm sort of constricted by constraints of the archives, in particular the colonial archives relating to people who've been long gone over a century ago and who left not a single written trace anywhere in any language. So how did you all decide on the people who are front and center in your accounts? I mean, they're absolutely fascinating people because once you start reading about one of the characters, you want to follow them, right? And in Alpa's case, she kind of has updates on her 5 people, whereas I think in Samira's, it kind of closes with, it's about the present, your present when you're reporting. And so we don't know whether, is Zele still alive? Has the mob wiped him out? Is he still racing to every scene of the crime and reporting with great success, and with his TV stations rating still sky high because he's so good at it? How do we make these choices? How did you all make these choices?
Should I respond and then kind of let
Sure.
others? Yeah.
Sure.
In my case, I think something else happened. In my case, by the time the final manuscript was ready to go, many of the people who were part of the book no longer wanted to be a part of the book. This was because we had the CAA, NRC, the violence in the country was just violence against minority communities was just so ubiquitous that people who initially spoke to me, who had agreed to be a part of this book, no longer wanted to be a part of this book. So a lot of this was also about kind of going back to the community and asking them what they wanted and what of these stories that they wanted to tell. Again, only a fraction of the stories went in, because what I really wanted to do was tell, for me, the ideas again was not to tell the story or bear witness. The idea was to do the ethnography of the state, turn the lens back, and what does that gaze tell us? And in that sense, I think every time I would do these interviews, I would translate them, I would do these chapters, and I would send it back to these communities and then have them read out. So I wanted them to be collaborators in this book. And often, I think even I kept the analysis part of it very little, simply because what I wanted to do was let these stories speak for themselves. So in my case, at least, definitely, I think a lot of the stories that end up in the book were stories that I could tell. In the India edition of the book, for instance, some of the photographs will not exist because we were not sure how safe it was. And in some of the book, photographs were removed because in this case, we had the name of the person. It had where they lived. It also had a photograph. And this was someone who had a run-in with the border security force and had been arrested. So in my case, at least, the choice was also the choice of the present. The history, what was happening in the present was dictating so much of what went inside the book and what didn't.
Yeah, and that's something I would also love to hear about, that by your highlighting or casting the spotlight on the people you choose to write about, are you putting a target on their back in some ways? Alpa, do you wanna,
Thanks, yeah, Anand. It's really, really interesting, a really interesting question. And in some ways, I think like I come from a similar perspective to Suchitra, in that, for me, the characters were not at all about bearing witness to their situation or, giving them voice, but they were, the reason why I chose the characters I chose is because there was a broader points that had to be made, a broader analysis about how movements like the Naxalites persist for so long, how they undermine themselves, why it is young Adivasi boys come together with these Naxalites, what is gender, Nandini's book and her kind of perspectives, and really the big kind of critique of patriarchy, which on the one hand movements like this are trying to overcome, but actually on the other hand they end up trying to perpetuate. And so my book was driven by these kinds of questions, and so the characters I chose were, the reason why I chose these characters was because they enabled me to tell those stories. They in a way they spoke for themselves about that wider analysis, and it wasn't just the characters on their own. it was that their interaction with each other, and how they got to know each other and what they did to each other over time. And so when you say also that, you know, I have these kind of updates on the characters at the end of the book, you know, those updates themselves actually reflect the kind of critique that is emerging from the analysis of the movement. So what happens to them actually bears witness of Gyanji, who is this intellectual who is an upper caste intellectual who breaks off his past to join this movement, actually in the end ends up getting caught because he maintains, it turns out he's maintained all his kinship relations. He hasn't kind of actually broken off his ties with the past. So you know, and then he himself is being a gang is formed by this guy Vikas, who ends up, you know, who's one of my other central characters, you know, who's a platoon commander who ends up undermining the movement and forming a gang, and he's out to kill Gyanji. And so all the updates are in fact you know, are not just updates of what happened to them, but they actually tell you something about the broader analysis that is emerging from as a result of the research. So yeah, so that's the reason why, you know, I chose the characters I did, because they tell you the particular issues that I want the book to address, because of that's what the research bears out. Yeah.
You know, your books are very good. When I wish I knew more about what happened to either real people or fictionalized characters. And I was sort of with Nandini's book, tell me more about why Saroj became the way she did. I hope Roderick is found somehow. Or with Samira's book, I think all 5 of your characters are such compelling figures that I wanted to know, so what's happened to them? Is Safdar still driving the ambulance around? Is Siraj still mapping out the, you know, what has happened to your characters? Because your book ends, what, about 5-6 years ago? Is that right?
Not that long ago. So it ends just kind of when I ended doing the research, which I think was sort of 2019, maybe, end of there. So yeah, so I sort of brought it up to, sorry, my cat's just decided to join in. I brought it up to as much of the present moment as I could. So it's kind of up to the moment that I finished the manuscript, really. But yeah, their circumstances have kind of changed in that the city is a lot safer. So Zile, for instance, I think where the book ends, his work has become, he sort of talked to me a lot about being bored, having been in this extremely grave danger for many years. And he's still working as a crime reporter. It's just the situation in the city is sort of calmer, so there's a less a sort of smaller range of crimes to report on. Safdar similarly is still working as an ambulance driver, but he's not doing quite the same sort of extreme first response rescue work as he was for the period of the book that I was writing about. So most of them are still carrying on their same work in some capacity. I think Jannat, the young woman who lives at the village at the edge of the city, will probably face the biggest change to her circumstances, because I think within the next decade, certainly, the village is likely to be razed to the ground for the new development that I mentioned. But yeah, in terms of kind of how I picked, I'm really being Zoom bombed here. In terms of how I picked the people who I wrote about, there was partly 2 concerns. One is similar to what Alpa and Suchitra were saying about wanting to represent certain kinds of stories and certain aspects of the urban conflicts in Karachi. So I knew I wanted to illustrate the sort of lived experience of the gang wars, which I think is something that's often, it had been reported in the international press a bit, but in a very kind of hypermasculine way, sort of, you know, and I think Vice had done a piece about, you know, the Scarface of Karachi, and that's the kind of lexicon that in which organized crime and mafias are often spoken about. And I wanted to talk about what's it actually like to live in these areas for people who aren't involved necessarily. And as I found with Parveen's story, you know, the gangs that become so inextricably tied into people's family networks and so on when it dominates your area. And I knew I wanted to talk about the ethnic conflict as well, and that's where Siraj's story was so useful. Siraj was also a way of talking about the way in which basic resources and sort of basic functions of the state become criminal commodities. So something as simple as your electricity or water supply, but becoming these kind of really high stakes criminal negotiations. And so that was one part of it. And the other part was much more pragmatic, I think. You've spoken about, as an academic and a historian, your sort of choices are dictated to an extent by archives. And I think for me, as a journalist, and a journalist who's sort of seeking to write creative nonfiction, which involves recreating someone's emotional state 10 years ago from something they told me, it really depends on who's willing to talk in that way, I think, and not everyone is willing to sort of spend hours and hours discussing sometimes very painful events from long ago, and to go over details which I think seem quite mundane, wanting to know sort of real specifics about long ago events and details about emotional state and the way things looked and smelled and so on. And not everyone talks in that way or remembers in that way necessarily, or is really willing to give up the time. So I was always very conscious of the extraordinary generosity that people were opening up their lives and memories to me in that way. But that was a big part of it, was people who could and were willing to share with me in that way, and who I thought would be compelling on the page, basically. So it's quite a pragmatic concern in one sense. But yeah, they're all, I'm in touch with them all, and they're all doing well. It's nice to hear that you were curious about what they're all up to. So yeah, things are slightly calmer, but yeah, it was a real joy to be able to spend that time with people. I always say that the best thing about my job is just being able to sort of be extremely nosy and ask people things that you would never otherwise have the opportunity to.
And if you see Samira disappear off our screen, it's because other duties call, right? Yes,
I've got a 4-week-old baby who's about to need to be fed, so that's why if I disappear. Thank you. But it's been a real pleasure to hear everyone talk about their work.
Thank you. Nandini, did you want to tell us about how your characters came into existence?
Oh, sure. I have no accountability, of course, being a creative, writer of fiction. I mean, that's the ultimate, Plato's cave. My roadside performers can do anything they want, but they are also run by me. So they have certain performances to ensure that they do. My characters as such came out of a long period of kind of ramblings within my family about things that had happened to women in the 19th century, things that had happened to my foremothers, little stories here, little stories there, but then some darker rumblings about what may have the untold stories that may have actually been hushed up during partition, both with members of my family as perpetrators and as survivors, or sometimes not survivors. So I didn't verbatim reproduce any stories, but these were all part of the sort of material out of which these different characters were formed. And I have that really to thank for, a kind of family archive. The other thing that happened in the fiction part of the historical fiction making is, of course, as sometimes creative writers say, all my characters are me. I am each and every one of them. So they do all become kind of mouthpieces, spokespersons for imaginary lives. I think that I, as one person, will never live, but that I think about as curious lives, and some closer to me than others, as in some of the family stories that I've heard about women feeling closer to me, but the stories that I've completely made up, which I didn't hear from people from women in my family also being very interesting to me, as in a kind of a what if kind of scenario. So I think because it's historical fiction, it has a lot to do with stories I've heard. And for what I'm writing now, actually, my second novel, it's based in America, contemporary America. And I guess in that case, it comes out of observations like the rest of us, just people we see around us and what we hear about. So.
I would love to hear from the four of you, particularly the three of you that are working with the present, the difficulties of being out there in the field as a woman.
Oh, yes.
And as a woman of possibly a different background than many of the men you encounter or many of the people you encounter. How do you work around it? How do you handle the hazards of doing research or being out there? So Chitra, Alpa, I think Samira has left us.
Okay.
I think kept thinking when I was reading your book, my goodness, you're wading into the lion's den there. That's gotta be brave. Or
I think there are two things. I think the first thing is that I don't think I could do the exact same journeys now. The book started in, whether it's Afghanistan or India, even in 2011, 10, 11, and 12, when I was in Afghanistan, people thought it was really unsafe. But now I don't think I couldn't go back to Afghanistan now and do this. And similarly, I cannot travel through India now. I started traveling in India in early 2013, and I traveled all the way till the end of 2018, early 2019. And I don't think India has become very unsafe. I could see India change even as I was traveling. Early on, I felt safe. I felt a sense of, also I felt very safe because the communities that I was interviewing went above and beyond to protect me. And they've always done that. And I think that's one thing that all of these communities have in common, is that their capacity to go above and beyond, their generosity, as Samira said, not only to tell their stories, but also share. Now I think it's impossible. By the time I finished the last leg of journey, it had become very unsafe. For me, traveling in India, it's interesting because I was born in the south of India. I'm a small, dark-skinned woman, and when I travel, I travel very specific ways. It's very difficult to look at me and give me an identity. I could be anything. I don't wear any physical markers. My hair is usually tied back really tight. I wear full-length loose shirts. So one could look at me and still not know who I am. And that started changing towards the end. By 2019, I would go to a space, especially in parts of Gujarat or other places. Also, the Gujarat chapter doesn't appear in the book because almost everybody who was part of the chapter no longer wanted to be a part of it. People started asking very specific questions about my religion, my caste, and sometimes I had to lie in order to to leave a situation. So India has become incredibly unsafe. So far more, I think my respect for journalists who are in India and report, and I think is just what they do is remarkable. But it's hard. It's incredibly hard to travel, and I think it's acknowledging it is important despite all of it. And I think it has become hard, but the communities, you need to know the community, and that's why it took so long. You go and you keep returning over and over and over again. In some ways, if you are there without the community that you want to speak about, then I think it becomes harder. So I'll kind of leave it at that.
Thanks. Yeah, it probably reflects a lot of what Suchitra's said. I do think too that it's impossible to do the kind of research that I did for Night March now. I think India is really a different place, and these areas are very, very different, including in Eastern and Central India. And I also completely relate to the fact that, you know, when you spend long times with particular communities, it's the communities that are actually go protect you. They're the ones that you know, that look after you. I remember I had these crazy conversations. Like when I first went to Jharkhand, there was even this kind of British development agent who was related to DFID, you know, here in England, who basically said, we can't let you go out there as a British citizen. You know, we can't let you go and live in those areas as a British citizen. And, you know, people would say, including the middle class, you know, friends that I had in India, they'd say, in Ranchi, they'd say, which is the capital of Jharkhand, yeah, you can, you know, why don't you stay here in Ranchi city and you take your, you know, Maruti and you go to those villages in the daytime and, you know, come back at night. And, you know, that's how you need to do your research. But it was my supervisors back in England, who said to me, you know, that no, you know, just, of course they're going to say that to you. What you have to do is go and live in those villages, because ultimately they are actually going to be your protectors. You know, you're going to form part of their kinship networks. You're going to become part of family there. And it, you know, that was all completely true. And to all of that, I'd like to add that I think that it would have been impossible for me, even at that time, to do research like this in Gujarat, where I have, you know, distant family roots, even though they're only very distant and I don't actually know anybody there right now. I always felt that I would be claimed as a Gujarati daughter. And so my movement would be really curtailed. And it was by chance, as I said, that I ended up in Jharkhand. But also, I think it is of great consequence that these areas of Jharkhand where I ended up living, you know, women have so much greater autonomy over their lives and over movement, and on, you know, on an equal footing in many respects to men. So, you know, they are not saying that they are equal, but partly I benefited from the fact that this was an area in which women, you know, women would move around freely on their own, you know, and I never felt scared, you know, going around at night, on, you know, whether it was walking or on a motorbike. And, you know, this is before I started studying the Naxites. Of course, when the counterinsurgency operations began, there was a whole load of other factors to consider. But I think that many of those things would have applied to a man. You know, the dangers would have applied as much to a man as a woman. And in some ways, it's, you know, there's also an advantage of being a woman, because you could, you know, like Suchitra, I would like, okay, I was not as dark as, you know, I could have been, but I would like, you know, oil my hair back and wear a sari, and I always dressed like, you know, local people, and I always traveled. If I had to travel long distances, I would, you know, go on public jeeps and public buses and wouldn't hire vehicles. Or so yeah, I felt, you know, also that the people protected me because I was a woman in some ways too. So yeah, it's, you know, it's a mixed thing. Partly, I think a lot of things that Suchitra said also bear out for me, but also the fact that the greater women's autonomy in Jharkhand, I felt I couldn't have done the same research in Bihar, even, which is just, you know, just to the north, very different. Yeah.
Can I jump in? I don't have any personal experience or observations, but can I say one thing? Part of the reason that I'm absolutely in awe of both of you and Samira when she was here is that I have never felt safe as a woman in India. I was born in 1964, and I spent my early years till my early 20s in India. I have never felt safe as a woman. I mean, there was some personal experiences that have to do with that, but I think that you are under representing the dangers and risks that you ran, and that you have been heroes. And I mean, just think about your advisor in London just kind of offering you up to this completely unknown and, you know, unfamiliar society where they have no idea what the risks are, what the real possible dangers are. I mean, wonderful, nothing happened to you, but things do happen to people, especially to women in India. And so I wanted to say that. But the other thing I wanted to say is, because I've never had to do that, I don't have to go out in the field and write anything in terms of fiction or even my scholarship. The question of violence, though, is very much on the top of my mind when I write anything I write, especially in the novel, for instance. Even though violence isn't necessarily an everyday part of my female characters' lives, except for Roma, who becomes a victim of partition violence, I hope that I was able to write about the characters, my female characters, as those who are in some ways constantly, implicitly under the threat of some kind of, if not violence, violation, even emotionally, psychologically, and of course, financially and in other ways. So I just want to say, I admire you and the work you have done. It is amazing. It's amazing. Can I also say one more? Yeah, go ahead. I just wanted to say, I would love to hear a little bit from Anand about your work too. Are we not going to talk about you because you're the moderator?
Well, there are so many questions directed at all of you that
Okay.
I'm just kind of working parts of my book into. I actually, most of my early work was on Bihar, but I was way north of where Alpa worked, even north of Gaya. So I was in North Bihar. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways I was able to blend in is either I had connections that opened up doors, because I would check in with the local district magistrate before I entered into an area. But once I got beyond that, I passed mostly as a Nepali. So I was a non-entity as far as people were concerned in North Bihar, and I'm close enough to Nepal. And because I'm a native Hindi speaker, that was no difficulty. So, and even when I was in Gaya at one point with a bunch of white Americans traveling around, I used to always kid that if Naxalites seized us, I would just say, take the sahibs away, I'm just their Nepali servant. You know, so I mostly didn't have a lot of difficulty, because when you're Nepali, when you're on the margins, you are so marginalized, nobody really even notices you out in the villages of North Bihar.
So that's another important thing too, to think about.
But I think the point you were making earlier about that most of the books seem to be about resistance, and my book is very much about it, but it's also about, to some extent, the futility of resistance, right? In a way, it's difficult to read any of your books, including Nandini's book, yes, and to see much room for optimism and hope. Do we have any responsibility as scholars and writers to offer that to our readers? Or given the subject matters that we're focusing on, they're mostly about people on the margins for whom life has been very dark, very cruel, very harsh, very oppressive, especially with this very powerful post-colonial or the colonial state bearing down on the people. How do I extract any hope or optimism from your books? Alpa?
I think we have to deal with this question sideways, and it is through the process of why we write, and what we're hoping to do in that process. And I'm just reminded of this piece that Sartre wrote called "Why Write." Mm-hmm. And he says that there's no art except for and by others. And writing kind of implies it's kind of dialectical correlative, which is that the world which is revealed in writing is like a joint effort between the author and the reader. And once you do that, you're basically drawing the reader into this world, which is an unjust world, which is a very, a world that is so bleak. All of our stories are so bleak. But once you do that, you're doing it because in order to transcend it, to bring the reader to create in their imagination what is being disclosed, and thus also take responsibility for it. And so, I feel like, at least for Night March, I had this kind of ethical imperative to make the reader part of this process and to understand what's happening here in order to also make them responsible for it, and so the hope is generated through that, through that process and through what these books hopefully might do in the world in some small kind of way, and move people in certain directions. So, yeah, I think it is a very bleak picture, undoubtedly, it's such a bleak picture, but the hope has to be taken from the fact that we are having books like Suchitra's or Samira's, or, and and what we can, anyway, I'm going on, but
I mean,
yeah.
But I really love that answer. That's a wonderful way of putting it.
That is an excellent answer. But in Suchitra's book, there is this wonderful little vignette of whenever the guards were not looking, boys from across the border would play cricket together, and there's this lovely moment where cricket sort of transcended the divide that existed. But such moments are fleeting and rare in most of the books. It's mostly, like even in your book, Nandini, it's people, the flight is back to the village, and one hopes that offers at least some escape from the violence that's sort of broken out in the big city, but it doesn't offer much else, right? And so it is, as to use Opa's words, very
and I have to say that I don't actually necessarily suggest one way or another to the reader how they should read that ending. I mean, what happened later in the villages, or has continued to happen in the villages, or happened before, I mean, the relationship of women to modernity in India, is something that I was really thinking about when I was writing the book. Like, what is the future for women of different classes, different backgrounds? These happen to be middle class or upper middle class and somewhat educated women. But the return to the village to me is not necessarily, I mean, it could kind of be like a Gandhian joke. Yes. I don't necessarily know the answer. So, but yes, I don't think I'm necessarily saying this is going to be wonderful after this because they went back to the village.
Given the timing of it, I immediately thought of Gandhi when you had your characters moving to the village. So for let's say a book like Alpa's, is your ideal reader someone who after reading your book is more sympathetic and understanding of the roots and the origins of the Naxalite movement? And one can ask a similar kind of question of Suchitra's, the portraits you present of your people that you encounter.
I mean, yes and no, not necessarily just the Naxalite movement. I mean, the fact is that there are, thousands and thousands of Adivasis who are in the jails of Central and Eastern India, allegedly, put there as Naxalites, right? And so, one of the many things I hope that, this book can convey is like why these guys are there. And it's not that they were just simply stuck between the two armies and put there. That story is much more complex, but hopefully, through reading the book, one has an understanding of why, people end up, like Kohli could have easily ended up, Gyanji, of course, is in jail. I mean, so many of my characters are the characters that are in those prisons, and so and then of course there's the whole Naxal issue that has become so through which so many other people are being targeted right now, as urban Naxals, as we know, with the Bhima Koregaon case too, in which Police Project Suchitra's organization has done so much wonderful work. And I'm hoping that people will have a better understanding of such issues. And I think that they're not just Indian issues. These are actually this story is more universal, and you know, you can tell it of many other conflicts around the world. So yeah, it's to have a deeper understanding of what lies at stake, not just with the Naxalite movement, but also all those people that are in prison as alleged Naxalites too, and the Adivasi situation especially.
So Chitra, what is one of the takeaways you would like to see your ideal reader?
I think one of the reasons I wrote this book was not to preach, but I really wanted people to read the individual stories and walk away with a sense of empathy. And as I write in the introduction, I think just as Alpa's story is, just as Samira's is, just as the stories that Nandini is trying to say, our stories are universal. The sense that the struggle for dignity, the struggle for freedom, the struggle for respect, but also we are living in the age of, in some ways, complete erosion of citizenship rights. And I'm just not talking about the Alis in the book or the Parveens that Samira writes about. I'm talking about all of us. You know, you could be an American citizen, you could be British, and our rights, you know, that we are in the middle of a surveillance state. We are all being reduced from citizens to be subjects, you know, subjects who can purchase, you know, surveilled subjects who are required for a capitalist economy. So the main question is to ask about, what does freedom mean? Can we reimagine? Because the way we live right now, we cannot go on living. And I don't talk about this in a utopian sense of, oh, the future is going to, no, the present.
No,
yeah, the present is so absolutely unlivable that we have to find better ways of living. Climate change will fundamentally remake the map of the world. 20 million people across the India-Bangladesh borderlands are already, I would say not victims, but survivors of climate change. What will they do? What will happen when this ocean swallows land in rates that I don't think even can imagine? And I think we need a better way of reconstituting ourselves, asking questions about who belongs, but where, but also how do we constitute ourselves? How do we rethink freedom? And those questions are not just questions for the future. And I think those are very existential questions. And that kind of goes back to the idea of resistance, right? And I think we all exist here today because somebody somewhere along resisted for something. My grandmother had to resist the patriarchy of a feudal system when, in the middle of the Great Famine in Madras, my grandfather left the village, moved to the presidency of Madras. And there's this incredible story that I found out just a few months ago, which has completely changed my own idea of resistance. At the moment of great personal distress, there's no land to farm. You're in the middle of a great debt. My grandfather comes to my grandmother and says, let's take our children to the ocean. Let's end it, because let's end this because that is better than living with the shame of debt. And my grandmother apparently told my grandfather that, no, you want to go kill yourself, you kill yourself. I'm going to keep the kids alive. If that moment of resistance hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here today. That is not to say that my grandmother had a glorious life. She did. You know, she was a victim of so much of the upheavals of a colonial state, a newly independent state that didn't quite guarantee what she wanted. Of course, a victim of so much violence, sexual violence, of course. And I think sexual violence is not just an act of partition. I think we've all lived with it. And I think as women, we inherit it. It goes back to the idea that in Madras, when I grew up, I wasn't allowed to do a lot of things. But the moment I left home, there are things that I could do that I couldn't do in my hometown, right? In some ways, the act of living in my home was far more dangerous than for me to go out and tell stories. And I think that is something that I've heard many of my friends who write think about. So in the book, I definitely want people to, and I think most readers have, when they've read the book, there is a sense of empathy. That the first thing is, I didn't know this was happening. And I think empathy is perhaps the roadmap to radical hope. And without radical hope, there is no future. So I think that's how I would think about what I want people to walk away with. Resistance is very complicated. It doesn't always end in triumph. And that's true, it never ends in triumph. It's very bleak. But sometimes resistance does make sense, and you have me standing here in front of you or speaking. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, right? So for those many resistance, those million mutinies that happen in our households that perhaps will never make it to the archives of history.
Somebody asked a specific question for Alpa. What does the future look like for the Adivasis with the Hindutva regime co-opting them to do their bidding?
Yeah, it's you know, all the things to us that I kind of resurrect in Night March. Well, especially when it comes to gender and women's autonomy and yeah, the better household relations that exist. I mean, all of those things are being crushed really with the rise of Hindutva politics, which has been taking place over a very slow, in a slow way over a long period of time. And, you know, they've been so effective because first they set up a whole load of schools in these areas. And, you know, people started sending their children to these schools, these Shishu mandirs, because they thought there are good schools, you know, not because of the politics, but these schools also generally, you know, have a very particular idea of masculinity, of yeah, all sorts of things taught in these schools, which then get, you know, over time get shape the Adivasi children who are being born in these villages, and yeah, and also health clinics, you know, they went in with these health clinics. So there's been this kind of slow transformation of these areas taking place, and a massive, you know, the Naxalite movement is like in really complete pockets now, you know, very, very, very limited. And what we have seen is the spread of Hindutva, of the RSS and the BJP, and Hindutva vision of society, which you know, in most of these areas. And yeah, I think it's was it Alka who asked that question? It's an important question, and it's a kind of quite a very bleak story. Yeah.
So you mentioned that Somari becomes attached to a Hindu guru of some sort. What exactly happened to her?
Yeah, so Samwari, well, actually, in her case, so these kind of cults, which could easily give rise to, you know, this was a Shiv Charcha cult, which was, you know, was being appropriated in other areas by the RSS. As it so happens, these cults come around in cycles in many Adivasi areas. People join them and then they leave them, you know. So it happened in Samwari's case. She has now, last time I was in touch with her, actually left this cult, but this cult is kind of very much spreading, and I think it's different for other people who have joined it. So yeah, so in some very specific case, and in fact, you know, I've done all this work on Birsa Munda, who is now resurrected as this anti-colonial, you know, hero. But in fact, you know, one of the papers I wrote about this was very much looking at how his own movement, Birsa Munda's movement, was like one of these Hindu cults, which then got you know, used in history in very different ways, in more radical ways. Of course, the BJP is now using them as well, but yeah, that's just to say that joining such cults could shape history in other ways to the Hindu right. But yeah, I think it's the work of these schools and these health clinics, which are very, very pervasive in spreading Hindutva in these areas.
So in the last few minutes here, what's next? What's on your plate? What's the next book, or the next article, or the next poem, or the next novel? I know we heard a little bit about what Nandini said she's working on.
I'll just add a little more, and then I want to hear what Suchitra and Alpa are doing. So I'm writing a novel about love, race, and immigration in the South Asian diaspora in the United States. And during and post Donald Trump era, the transformation of the consciousness of being the model minority as seen through one particular female protagonist and her experiences. That's what I'm doing.
And the character has no bearing to any of your previous people. They're not related.
Not in any way, any way sequelish or related, but I'm sure some of what I think try to say is that in Love's Garden, the women become radicalized in some way. I mean, in a very limited way, but in some way. And I think that's what's going to happen to the protagonist in this novel. She is going to be radicalized from being a model minority. So in that sense, maybe there's a connection, but no, nothing else.
I'm just thinking of these connections because when I think of some of Alpa's work, I keep thinking that the Night March book would have been a lot more difficult to write without the previous book. Mm-hmm. That the time you spent living and working with Adivasis prepared you very well to enter into the Naxalite scene and to be accepted because you had a certain amount of credibility and you knew some of the people because they were son of, daughter of people you had encountered previously. So is the next book on Bisra Munda?
The next book is, yeah, it's about the unraveling of democracy in India. And it's also going to be told through certain characters. You know, I haven't decided whether it's 4, 5, or 6 yet. And, you know, once you've written books like Night March, you know, you can't go back to the academic writing. So I think it's much more challenging for us as academics because we've been trained out of writing for wider audiences. It's actually much more difficult. I'm sorry in all of you, Nandini, of having made this leap, you know, into fiction writing. I agree with Suchitra. It's just so much more difficult to imagine, but you know, it's really, yeah, it'll be a book for a wider audience too. But yeah, that's all. Sorry.
Looking forward to it. Immense.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it feels a big responsibility. So that's all I will say for the moment.
Suchitra?
Well, I'm going to copy the line that a friend of mine recently told me when I asked, you know, well, what are you going to do next? And she basically said, you know, I took 4 years to write this damn book, so please read this one first. So I thought that was so great. Honestly, I'm just very exhausted. It took me 8 years to do this book. And now that the book has come out, it also came out in the middle of a pandemic. And ideally, I would have loved to be with the people who are in the book. I would have loved to be in India. I would have loved, initially, one of the things that I wanted to do was not do the big events, but just go to the communities that are in the book, take the books with me to them, be in conversation with them. That has not happened. I haven't been home for almost 2 years. So I'm just a little, I don't know, I'm feeling very anxious. Having said that, I really do finally want to, now that I have a book of nonfiction out, I really want to go back to the fiction notes that I've kept since I was, I think it was 15. It's been so long. I don't know if something will come out of it, but I definitely want to think about. I think also it's become, perhaps fiction is the last frontier. I don't know. When I was reading Alpa's book, I just kept thinking, oh my God, how have they not banned this book yet? Also realizing that just even speaking truth has become so difficult in the subcontinent. So definitely want to think about fiction as a way of writing. But having said that, despite how difficult it is, I think as writers, I think our job is to respond to our social realities. So writing will be an important part of it. surprisingly, I'm also working on a cookbook of my grandmother's recipes, which is, I have no idea how from Midnight's Borders, I'm now working on a cookbook, but yeah, so
Sustenance.
sustenance, yes. So it's something that we did when I was pregnant, and my mom kind of, because my grandmother passed away when I was a few months old. And my mother started recording these recipes for my little girl. And we did that through my first and second trimester. And we have about 300 recipes. And I want to find a way to put it together along with the stories that I shared about my grandmother, but also how it's important for us to pass on more than just recipes. I've just started work on that. So hopefully, fingers crossed, something will come out of it, hopefully.
Yeah.
On that high note, I don't know whether we're supposed to wrap it up at exactly at 3 o'clock, but it's 3 o'clock. It is, what is it? 11 o'clock in London, is it, Alpa? Are you 11?
It is indeed, yes.
And it is beginning to be time to wake up in India. Not quite yet. I think given the time we chose, it was going to be very difficult to have much of an audience from South Asia, because I posted about this panel and several people in India said, oh my goodness, I don't think I can be up at that hour, because we started at what?
Yeah, it's very,
like
very
3:30 a.m. or something like that. So,
well, I do appreciate everyone's presence and the conversation, and a big thanks to you, Anand, for doing this Herculean job of getting us all on the same plane and talking about it. And it has been an absolute pleasure. I do have to go, but thank you so much. And I hope we will be in touch later.
we will be in touch. And if you haven't done so, make sure to read each other's works.
Yes, no, I've already
Absolutely.
started and done quite a bit, but I will finish.
Well, thank you all for the gift of your books. They're absolutely wonderful to read. And I've learned a lot about fiction, as well as creative nonfiction, as well as nonfiction. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, good night, good morning.
Night, good afternoon.
Yes.